The book of Judges is one of the darkest books in the entire Bible. Joshua ends with hope. The promised land has been conquered. God has fulfilled his promises. The people renew their covenant. Everything seems to be moving in the right direction. But then Joshua dies. And almost immediately, everything begins to fall apart. The book of Judges tells the story of what happens when God's people slowly drift away from him. It isn't one continuous story. It's a series of stories. Different leaders, different battles, different generations. Yet every story follows the exact same pattern. The people forget God. They begin worshiping false gods. Their enemies overpower them. They cry out to God for help. God raises up a judge to rescue them. The people experience peace for a time. Then the judge dies. And the cycle begins all over again. Again, and again, and again. Each time becoming worse than before. The book begins after Joshua's death. Israel continues driving out some of the remaining Canaanite nations. But they don't finish the job. Instead of completely obeying God's command, they compromise. Some enemies are left in the land. Some are forced into labor instead of being removed. Others are allowed to remain altogether. At first, these decisions don't seem like a big deal. But compromise rarely stays small. Over time, Israel begins living alongside people who worship false gods. Their beliefs begin to influence God's people. And little by little, Israel starts looking more like the surrounding nations than the people God had called them to be. Then an angel of the Lord appears with a heartbreaking message. I brought you out of Egypt. I brought you into the land I promised. But you have not obeyed me. The consequences begin almost immediately. The nations they refuse to remove become a constant source of temptation and oppression. Soon a new generation grows up. One of the saddest verses in the entire book tells us that they did not know the Lord or what he had done for Israel. Think about that. One generation removed from Joshua. One generation removed from seeing God's miracles. And already they have forgotten. So they begin worshiping Baal and Asherah, the false gods of the surrounding nations. God allows neighboring kingdoms to oppress them, not because he has abandoned them, but because he is calling them back. Eventually the people cry out for help, and God responds with mercy. He raises up the first judge, Othniel. He defeats Israel's enemies, and the land experiences peace. But after Othniel dies, the cycle begins again. This time, God raises up Ehud, one of the most unexpected heroes in Scripture. Ehud is left-handed, a detail that becomes important. He hides a sword on the opposite side of his body, where guards don't expect to find it. He gains a private meeting with the Moabite king, Eglon. Then, in a dramatic moment, he assassinates the oppressive king and escapes. Israel is delivered once again. Peace returns, until the people drift away again. Next comes Deborah, the only female judge in the book, a wise leader and prophet whom God uses to lead Israel. She calls upon a military commander named Barak to fight the Canaanite army. Barak agrees, but only if Deborah goes with him. The battle begins. God sends confusion into the enemy army. Their mighty commander Sisera flees on foot, seeking refuge inside the tent of a woman named Jael. She welcomes him, offers him milk, lets him rest. Then, after he falls asleep, she drives a tent peg through his head. A surprising ending, but another reminder that God often accomplishes his purposes through the most unexpected people. Peace returns. For a while, then the cycle repeats. Again. This time Israel is oppressed by the Midianites. They hide in caves. Their crops are stolen. Their land is stripped bare. And that's where we meet Gideon. He's hiding while secretly threshing wheat. Hardly the picture of a fearless warrior. Yet the angel of the Lord greets him with unexpected words. The Lord is with you, mighty warrior. Gideon can hardly believe it. He questions God, questions himself, asks for signs, again and again. First fire from a rock, then a fleece wet with dew while the ground stays dry, then the opposite. Still, God patiently reassures him. Eventually, Gideon gathers an army, 32,000 men, but God says it's too many. If Israel wins with that army, they'll think they accomplished it themselves. So God reduces the army, first to 10,000, then to only 300 men, 300, against an army that filled the valley like locusts, armed not with powerful weapons, but with trumpets, clay jars, and torches. At night they surround the enemy camp. The jars are smashed, the torches blaze, the trumpets sound, the Midianites panic. Confusion spreads. They begin fighting one another, and Israel wins without a conventional battle. Another impossible victory that only God could receive credit for. But even Gideon's story ends with compromise. He makes an ephod that eventually becomes an idol. And after his death, Israel falls away once more. The stories continue growing darker. Jephthah makes a reckless vow to God before battle, a vow that leads to heartbreaking consequences. Then comes perhaps the most famous judge of all, Samson. From birth, Samson is set apart for God. His incredible strength becomes legendary. He tears apart a lion with his bare hands, defeats entire armies, carries away the gates of a city. Yet despite his strength, he repeatedly struggles with self-control. His greatest battles are not against the Philistines, they're against his own desires. Eventually, Samson falls in love with a woman named Delilah. The Philistines bribe her to discover the secret of his strength. Again and again she asks. Again and again Samson deceives her. Until finally, he tells her the truth. His hair is cut. His strength leaves him. He's captured, blinded, bound in chains. The once mighty judge is forced to entertain his enemies. But in his final moments, Samson prays. God restores his strength one last time. He pushes against the pillars of the Philistine temple. The building collapses. And Samson dies, defeating more enemies in his death than during his life. Yet even Samson's story cannot stop Israel's decline. The final chapters of Judges contain almost no judges at all. Instead, they show a nation spiraling into complete moral chaos. Idolatry spreads. Violence increases. Civil war erupts between the tribes. The book becomes increasingly disturbing, and it ends with one sentence repeated twice. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Those words summarize the entire book. Judges isn't primarily about military battles. It's about the human heart. When people reject God's authority, they don't become truly free. They become enslaved to sin. Again and again, Israel proves that external victories cannot change an inward heart. They needed more than judges. They needed lasting transformation. And that's exactly what the rest of the Bible begins pointing toward. A greater deliverer, a greater king, one who would not simply rescue people from their enemies, but rescue them from sin itself. The story of Judges leaves us with an uncomfortable question. What happens when we decide that our way is better than God's? Because that's exactly how every cycle in this book begins. Small compromises, slow drifting, forgetting God's faithfulness, choosing what feels right instead of what God says is right. And before long, the consequences become far greater than anyone expected. So here's the question Judges leaves us with. Are there areas of your life where you've slowly begun to compromise? Places where you've started doing what seems right in your own eyes instead of seeking God's wisdom? Because Judges reminds us that spiritual drift rarely happens overnight. It happens one small decision at a time, but it also reminds us of something else. No matter how many times Israel failed, God continued to respond when they cried out. Again and again, His mercy was greater than their rebellion. And that same mercy is still available today. Because even in one of the darkest books of the Bible, we find a God who never stops pursuing His people.